in the cold between stars, where light bent faintly in time felt irrelevant. Something vast drifted without sound, without signal, without acknowledgement. The Aegis vortex did not announce itself. It never needed to an outside observer. If any could survive close enough to observe, it would appear as a distortion rather than a structure, not a ship in the traditional sense, but an absence shaped into form. Its hull was layered with adaptive metamaterials that refracted sensors, absorbed emissions, and reconfigured its surface depending on what tried to perceive it. To passive scans, it registered as nothing more than background noise. To active probes, it returned fragmented echoes that led nowhere. Alien scouts had tried, only once. Their vessels approached from 3 vectors, expecting to triangulate its position. Their instruments locked on and then failed. Not violently, not dramatically, just quietly. Their targeting systems lost coherence. Their navigation drifted. Their logs later contained gaps, entire seconds of missing data that their engineers could never fully explain. Those ships never reported back. And so, across several species, the name human anomaly began circulating in restricted archives, buried beneath layers of dismissed intelligence reports. Humanity itself was considered a mid-tier civilization, advanced in strategy, but lacking the scale and brute force that defined true interstellar powers. Their territories were small, their presence understated, their behavior unusually restrained, which made the Aegis vortex all the more confusing. It was too large for a single ship doctrine, too complex for a mere flagship, and yet no accompanying fleet was ever detected near it. No escorts, no visible supply chain, no obvious support network. It traveled alone, or so it appeared. Inside, the vessel was anything but empty. Silent corridors stretched through kilometers of structured compartments, most of them dormant. Sections of the ship existed in a standby state, their systems only partially active, conserving energy as though waiting for a signal that had not yet come. At the core of the vessel lay its command lattice, an intricate fusion of artificial intelligence and human strategic oversight. Not fully autonomous, not fully dependent. A hybrid system designed to adapt faster than any purely organic or synthetic mind could manage alone. Within that core, subtle fluctuations pulse like a heartbeat. Not life, not machine, something in between. Human operators monitored from distant command stations light years away, connected through encrypted quantum channels that resisted interception. Their presence aboard the Aegis vortex was minimal, almost ceremonial. They did not command the ship in real time. They guided it through principles, doctrines, and pre-established frameworks. Because the ship was never meant to react. It was meant to endure, to observe, to wait. On the outer hull, faint ripples occasionally passed across its surface. Micro-adjustments responding to environmental stress, recalibrating thermal distribution, or compensating for gravitational anomalies. To an untrained observer, these movements might suggest vulnerability. In reality, they were signs of readiness. Far beyond the visible layers, internal systems tracked thousands of variables simultaneously. Stellar drift patterns, gravitational fluctuations, subspace distortions, and distant energy signatures that hinted at movement across sectors. The Aegis vortex knew more about the surrounding space than any fleet could perceive. And still it remained still, not because it was inactive, but because it had not yet been authorized to act. In human doctrine, restraint was not weakness, it was precision. Every action taken by the vessel had been accounted for, simulated, and evaluated against outcomes spanning decades. Nothing aboard the Aegis vortex was improvised. Every system, every response pathway, every contingency existed for a reason. And somewhere deep within its layered command protocols, buried beneath tiers of redundancy and silence, there existed a single directive: do not reveal the full extent of capability unless absolutely necessary. The galaxy, for the most part, had never needed to know, until now, because beyond the horizon of scattered starlight, something was approaching. Multiple signals, coordinated, intentional, not a random encounter, but convergence. The Aegis vortex's internal systems registered the approach instantly, not as a threat, not yet, as a possibility. Its sensors refined focus, narrowing attention toward the incoming signatures. Energy patterns resolved into identifiable formations, fleet structures, weapon configurations, mass distributions. And with that, the vessel adjusted, not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly, internally, like a predator shifting its weight before deciding whether to strike or remain still. Far away, the approaching coalition believed they were entering uncontested space. They had no escorts to fear, no defensive fleets to contend with, Only a single human warship drifting in silence. To them, it was an opportunity. To the Aegis Vortex, it was a moment that had been anticipated long before their arrival. And as the distance between them closed, one truth remained hidden beneath layers of silence, technology, and restraint. They had already been observed and judged. The first transmission from humanity arrived without warning. No dramatic flare across open channels. No ceremonial broadcast. No attempted intimidation. Just a narrow band, encrypted signal. So precise it slipped through the Coalition's communication arrays like a whisper threading between guarded thoughts. It appeared in the command nodes of 3 flagship vessels simultaneously, bypassing standard authentication layers as if it had been pre-approved by their own systems. It was not. Alarm protocols triggered instantly. Officers scrambled to isolate the intrusion. Defensive countermeasures activated. Analysts traced the signal origin, only to find it fragmented across impossible coordinates. No single point of origin. No stable signature. The message was not being sent in the traditional sense. It was being delivered. Across the Coalition's command hierarchy, tension replaced certainty. The message itself was simple. No threats. No demands. No declarations of superiority. Only an offer. A corridor was identified along the Coalition's projected advance. A narrow region of space marked in neutral terms. The transmission described it as a designated engagement boundary and recommended that all non-essential hostilities cease within its perimeter. In essence, humanity was asking them to stop. The Coalition interpreted it differently. On the bridge of the flagship Gravemind Ascendant, a species known for its conquest-driven doctrine reviewed the message with thinly veiled amusement. Their commander, towering, armored, and adorned with relics taken from defeated worlds, watched a holographic projection of the human signal replay in silence. No aggression, no fear, just structure, precision, control. A subordinate officer spoke first. "They are attempting to dictate terms," the officer said, antennae twitching with irritation. "A single vessel, alone, and they expect us to reroute an entire campaign." A low rumble of laughter spread through the command deck. The Coalition had seen many civilizations attempt negotiation at the edge of collapse. Most begged, some threatened, others delayed inevitability, with pleas disguised as strategy. This was different. This was calm. And to them, calm resembled weakness. "Verify their position," the commander ordered. Within seconds, sensors confirmed what they already suspected. One ship, no accompanying fleet, no defensive grid, no visible reinforcement signals within scanning range. Just the Aegis Vortex, drifting in a region the humans had marked. The Coalition cross-referenced their attack simulations. Probability models ran in parallel, calculating outcomes against a lone target. Every result converged on the same conclusion: overwhelming victory, minimal losses, complete dominance. A final test was conducted, weapons targeting systems locked onto human vessels' coordinates. Tactical AI systems simulated a coordinated strike using full fleet capacity. The outcome was trivial. Too trivial. Confidence hardened into certainty. The commander dismissed the human transmission with a wave of his hand. "Transmit our response," he said. "We proceed as planned." Another officer hesitated. "Should we not at least—" "Fear," the commander interrupted, turning slowly, "is not something they possess. It is something they are about to learn." Laughter returned to the room, sharper this time. Within moments, the Coalition resumed full operational tempo. Fleets adjusted formation vectors. Weapon systems charged. Planetary siege units aligned. Logistics chains activated in preparation for occupation rather than battle. No one questioned the decision. No one revisited the transmission. It had been filed, categorized, and dismissed as a procedural anomaly. Meanwhile, the human signal remained open for several seconds longer than necessary, not repeating, not escalating, just present, as if waiting. Then it vanished. Back aboard the Coalition flagship, the absence of further communication was interpreted as confirmation compliance or surrender. After all, weaker civilizations often withdrew when ignored, but the humans had not withdrawn. They had simply stopped speaking. Moments later, the Coalition's forward fleets entered the designated corridor. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Space remained quiet. Sensors continued to report nominal conditions. No gravitational irregularities. No unexpected energy fluctuations. No defensive formations. The Aegis Vortex appeared exactly as it had been before. Solitary, unmoving, and unguarded. Somewhere deep within coalition ranks, anticipation grew. This was it. The moment of first contact under fire. The opportunity to demonstrate superiority. Weapon systems across multiple vessels locked in unison. Target acquisition finalized. Fire control algorithms synchronized. And then, a second transmission pulse briefly flickered across coalition channels. Not a warning this time. Not a request. Just a single, repeating fragment embedded in the background of their tactical feeds. So faint it almost went unnoticed. A pattern buried beneath noise. An anomaly. One analyst flagged it, then another, but before it could be examined further, the fleet commander issued the final order. Engage! The coalition fired, and in that instant, before the first projectile crossed half the distance between ships and target, the Aegis vortex ceased to be perceived as alone, because something within the human network had just acknowledged the attack, and across the hidden architecture of human defense doctrine, a threshold had been crossed. Space did not explode all at once. It unraveled. The coalition's opening volley arrived in disciplined waves, coordinated beams of ionized plasma, accelerated kinetic slugs traveling at relativistic fractions, and gravitic pulses designed to destabilize structural integrity at the molecular level. Each weapon was timed, calculated, and directed to converge on the Aegis vortex from multiple vectors, ensuring no margin for evasive response. To the coalition commanders, it was not merely an attack. It was a demonstration. Hundreds of ships aligned in synchronized formation, their firing solutions locked with machine precision. Entire battle groups contributed overlapping trajectories, creating a lattice of destruction so dense that even a partial hit would be catastrophic. The first impact struck the Aegis vortex's outer defenses. For a brief moment, reality bent. Shields flared into existence, not as static barriers, but as dynamic fields that adapted in real time. Where energy weapons struck, the shields absorbed and redistribute heat. Where kinetic rounds impacted, localized distortions redirected momentum away from critical zones. The ship's surface shimmered, not as a sign of damage, but as a visible response to stress. Then the second wave hit, and the third. The coalition's confidence began to tighten into focus. Target tracking systems confirmed repeated strikes on the same coordinates. No evasive maneuvers detected. No counterfire returned. No propulsion burst suggesting retreat or repositioning. The Aegis vortex remained stationary, unmoving under sustained bombardment. A few officers leaned forward on their consoles. Shields are degrading. One reported, voice edged with anticipation. At current rates. Continue fire, the commander interrupted. Across the fleet, weapons intensified. Energy output surged. Reserve capacitors drained into continuous barges. Secondary batteries joined the assault. Even auxiliary vessels contributed their firepower, saturating space with overlapping fields of destruction. The void around the human ship became a storm of light. Sensors struggled to maintain clarity amid the intensity. Automated filters compensated, recalibrating constantly to distinguish between weapon signatures and feedback noise. Within that chaos, the coalition believed they were witnessing progress, because the Aegis vortex began to change. Subtle at first, sections of its hull that had previously appeared inert began to shift. Panels realigned. Surface geometry adjusted in response to incoming vectors. Instead of resisting damage through sheer force, the ship redistributed stress across its structure, dispersing impact points across broader regions. Its defenses were not static. They evolved under pressure. A new pattern emerged in the coalition's targeting systems. Hits were still landing, but their effectiveness was decreasing. Adaptive shielding. An analyst muttered, disbelief creeping into his tone. It's learning. On the flagship bridge, the commander's expression hardened. Adjust targeting protocols. Increase convergence density. Focus fire on a single quadrant. The fleet complied. Weapons were retargeted. Instead of spreading fire across the vessel, the coalition concentrated their assault on one region of the hull, aiming to overwhelm localized defenses through sheer intensity. For several seconds, the strategy appeared effective. Shields in the targeted zone flickered more violently. Structural stress indicators began to spike. Small fragments, microscopic debris, began to peel away from the outer layers. The coalition detected the shift immediately. Penetration imminent. A voice announced. Momentum built. More weapons converged. More ships joined the focus fire. The Aegis vortex now appeared visibly strained, its silhouette partially obscured by the continuous cascade of impacts. Sections of its surface dimmed under sustained pressure, giving the impression that the coalition had finally found the threshold of its resilience. And then the distortion began, not from the ship, but around it. Sensors aboard coalition vessels started to experience minor inconsistencies. Distance measurements fluctuated by fractions of a percent. Targeting overlays shifted slightly out of alignment. At first, these discrepancies were dismissed as interference caused by the intensity of the battlefield. But the anomalies grew. Gravitational readings near the Aegis vortex no longer matched expected values. Light itself appeared to bend inconsistently around its perimeter, as though the space around the ship had become layered, compressed, or subtly refracted through unseen mechanisms. A secondary warning appeared across multiple command systems. Spatial integrity variance detected. Recalibration failed. Inside the chaos of battle, something had changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally. The coalition was no longer simply attacking a stationary target. They were engaging an environment that was actively responding to their presence. And deep within the human vessel, beyond the layers of shielding and adaptive systems, a threshold indicator reached a critical point. A status previously dormant now transitioned. From observation to response readiness. The Aegis vortex had endured the initial strike, and in doing so, it had confirmed everything it needed to know. The final strike came without hesitation. Across the coalition fleet, every available weapon that could still bear upon the Aegis vortex was brought to focus. Energy capacitors surged to their limits. Kinetic accelerators reached peak output. Entire wings of warships aligned in perfect synchronization, their targeting matrices collapsing into a single shared solution. This was no longer a test of strength. It was a conclusion. The coordinates of the human vessel were locked with absolute precision. Every variable accounted for: drift, relativistic lag, gravitational interference, even the subtle distortions caused by their own weapons' fire. No margin remained. Fire. The order propagated instantly through the fleet. What followed was not a volley, but a convergence. Beams of concentrated energy lanced across the void in overlapping paths, forming a lattice of destruction so dense it appeared solid. Kinetic projectiles, already accelerated to near-light speeds, arrived milliseconds behind the energy wavefronts. Gravitic disruptors triggered in coordinated pulses, warping the space around the target to amplify the destructive impact. For a brief, suspended instant, space itself seemed to hesitate. Then everything arrived at once. The Aegis vortex was engulfed in a sphere of overlapping detonations. Shields that had been struggling under sustained pressure finally collapsed in a cascading failure. The collapse wasn't instantaneous. It unraveled in layers, each defensive field failing in sequence as overload thresholds were exceeded. Energy overflowed. Structural integrity indicators across coalition sensors spiked beyond measurable limits. Fragments began to tear away from the ship's outer hull. At first, they were small panels, plating, components exposed by the breach of defenses. Then larger sections followed. Entire segments of the vessel's exterior disintegrated under the compounded force of the strike. Within seconds, the silhouette of the Aegis vortex was no longer coherent. It fractured, then dispersed. The coalition sensors registered what appeared to be total structural failure. No active shielding, no detectable propulsion, no coherent energy signature consistent with operational systems. Only scattered debris fields drifting outward from the point of impact. Target neutralized, an analyst reported, voice steady but edged with disbelief. Across the command decks of multiple vessels, silence followed. Not the uneasy silence of uncertainty, but the stillness that comes after a decisive outcome. They had done it. The lone human warship, once shrouded in mystery, once resistant to their most concentrated assault, had been destroyed. On the flagship bridge, the commander exhaled slowly. For the first time since the engagement began, tension loosened from his posture. Confirmed destruction, he ordered. Sensor teams ran their final diagnostics. Multiple arrays cross-referenced the battlefield. Thermal readings, residual energy patterns, debris dispersal trajectories. All indicators aligned. There was nothing left to fight. No hidden energy spikes. No secondary missions. No signs of emergency ejection or escape vectors. The Aegis vortex had been reduced to fragments. A subordinate officer allowed himself a faint expression of satisfaction. They never even responded, he said. Not once. A few nearby crew members exchanged glances. The absence of retaliation had been noted throughout the engagement, but now it carried a different meaning. Not fear, not hesitation. Absence. And in the minds of the coalition commanders, that absence confirmed their interpretation of humanity's capabilities. Contained, limited, outmatched, Broadcast victory confirmation to all battle groups, the commander said, returning to a composed stance. And prepare initial occupation protocols for adjacent human-controlled territories. The message went out immediately. Within moments, coalition channels lit up with acknowledgments, celebratory exchanges, and tactical reassessments, shifting from combat to consolidation. Fleet formations began to relax from combat-ready posture into transitional configurations. Weapon systems powered down or returned to standby states. The battlefield, once saturated with concentrated fire, began to quiet. Debris from the destroyed vessel continued to drift outward, catching distant starlight in fragmented glimmers. What remained of the Aegis vortex was no longer a coherent object, but a dispersed field of wreckage, silent, cold, and inert. To the coalition, it was proof of superiority, proof that even the most enigmatic human assets could be overcome through sufficient coordination and force. A warning to others, and a message to themselves. They had prevailed. Back on the flagship, strategic maps updated automatically, marking the region as secured. Simulation overlays projected future movements, supply lines, forward staging areas, planetary targets beyond the current engagement zone. The war, in their estimation, had shifted phases. The unknown had been removed. And yet, in the quiet moments that followed, as systems stabilized and crews began transitioning from combat urgency to operational routine, a subtle inconsistency remained in the data logs. A single, unaccounted fluctuation, not large enough to trigger alarms, not significant enough to demand immediate investigation, just a deviation, a gap, a moment where readings did not fully align with expected outcomes. It passed unnoticed by most, but recorded nonetheless, filed within the vast accumulation of battlefield telemetry, unexplained, unresolved, because while the coalition believed they had witnessed the destruction of the Aegis vortex, they had only observed what the ship allowed them to see. And somewhere, buried beneath the debris they now claimed as victory, something had already begun to respond. Victory, in the coalition's experience, was usually followed by noise, celebrations, reorganization, the rapid shift of focus from destruction to expansion. Orders would cascade through command hierarchies as conquered space was analyzed, divided, and absorbed into logistical frameworks. But this time, there was silence, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence that comes when an expected reaction fails to arrive. Minutes passed after the destruction of the Aegis vortex, then hours. Fleet commanders expected the standard sequence: distress signals from nearby human assets, emergency fleet deployments, interception attempts, or at minimum, encrypted diplomatic communication acknowledging the loss and attempting negotiation. None came. The human channels remained dark. At first, this was interpreted as disarray. A civilization losing one of its primary warships would typically require time to reorganize its command structure. Analysts propose that humanity's decentralized nature might be causing delays in response. But as more time passed, that explanation began to erode, because nothing changed. No new signals, no fleet movements, no detected mobilization of defense assets, no shifts in energy usage across known human-controlled systems. It was as if the destruction of their warship had not triggered any immediate reaction at all. On the coalition flagship, data analysts began compiling reports. Confirmed absence of retaliation vectors within projected time frames. No escalation detected. Human communication networks remain inactive across monitored channels. A growing unease began to surface, not openly, not yet, but in the quiet hesitations between reports, in the extra seconds taken before confirming previously accepted assumptions. Across multiple vessels, sensors continued to scan the region where the Aegis vortex had been destroyed. Debris remained scattered across a wide field, drifting slowly under the influence of gravitational gradients. Fragments of hull plating, energy-damaged components, and structural remnants continued to cool as they radiated residual heat into the void. But something subtle was wrong. The debris field did not behave entirely as expected. There were minor inconsistencies in dispersal patterns, slight variations in velocity that did not align perfectly with the recorded impact forces. Some fragments appeared to have trajectories that suggested secondary influence. Tiny corrections, almost imperceptible, as though influenced by forces not accounted for in coalition models. At first, these discrepancies were attributed to sensor drift or environmental interference caused by the intensity of the prior engagement. Corrections were applied, readings recalibrated. The anomalies persisted, but remained within tolerable thresholds. Then the first activation occurred. It was not visible, not immediately. A dormant relay buried within the debris field emitted a brief, tightly compressed pulse of energy. It was not a broadcast signal in the traditional sense. It carried no message, no identifiable encoding, no attempt at communication. It was a handshake, a trigger, on human-controlled systems far beyond the battlefield. Hidden across multiple star systems, dormant nodes received the pulse and responded. Across the Coalition's monitor perimeter, subtle changes began to emerge. Long-range sensors detected faint fluctuations in subspace channels previously considered inactive. Power signatures that had been dormant for extended periods began to register minimal but consistent activity, not enough to indicate open mobilization, but sufficient to confirm that systems once thought idle were now transitioning into operational readiness. Still, these signals remain fragmented, dispersed, uncoordinated, at least from the Coalition's perspective. On the flagship bridge, a junior analyst flagged one of the anomalies. "Commander," she said, her tone measured but cautious, "we are detecting low-level activations across multiple human-aligned systems. Not concentrated, distributed. It appears gradual." The commander reviewed the data. Lines of faint activity stretched across the tactical display, forming a pattern that was difficult to interpret at first glance. Not a centralized response. Not a single fleet deployment. Instead, scattered nodes activating independently, yet in a manner that suggested underlying coordination. "Could this be delayed reaction?" he asked. "Possibly," another officer replied, "or pre-programmed contingencies." The commander narrowed his gaze slightly. Pre-programmed. That implied foresight, preparation, planning beyond immediate reaction. He leaned forward. "Continue monitoring. Increase scan resolution along human-controlled sectors. Identify any concentration of activity." As the fleet stabilized in post-engagement posture, additional reports began to arrive. More anomalies, more activations, not concentrated enough to indicate a direct counteroffensive, but too structured to be random. And still, no central command response, no flagship transmissions, no visible coordination signal. It was as though humanity had not yet chosen to act, or had already acted in ways not immediately visible. The debris field continued to drift, silent, cold, unassuming. Yet beneath that silence, something had changed. Because the destruction of the Aegis vortex had not eliminated a threat, it had completed a condition, and across hidden layers of human-controlled space, systems that had remained dormant for years began to acknowledge a shared reality. A threshold had been crossed. Protocols designed long before this moment were no longer waiting. They were waking. And though the Coalition believed the battlefield had quieted, in truth, the first responses had already begun, not in force, not in fire, but in preparation. The storm had not yet arrived, but the silence was no longer empty. The first sign that something was wrong was not an attack. It was access. Across Coalition command systems, secured archives began to experience unauthorized queries, subtle, indirect, and almost invisible to standard intrusion detection protocols. These were not brute force breaches. No firewall alarms triggered. No defensive countermeasures engaged. Instead, the queries appeared as legitimate system interactions, as if they had always been allowed. Analysts reviewing log integrity noticed inconsistencies in temporal alignment. Certain access requests appeared to originate from within trusted channels, but referenced authentication keys that should not have existed at the time of their issuance. At first, these discrepancies were dismissed as synchronization errors between distributed systems, but then patterns emerged. The same access signatures appeared across multiple vessels simultaneously, not identical in structure, but functionally equivalent, and all of them pointed toward the same conclusion. Something within their own networks was already familiar with their systems. On the flagship bridge, tension began to return, not in response to an external threat, but in response to uncertainty within their own infrastructure. "Isolate all non-essential network links," the commander ordered. "Run full integrity verification across command nodes." "Already in progress," replied the systems officer. "No confirmed breaches, but anomalous access patterns are being detected across multiple subsystems." Source. A pause. Indeterminate. That word hung in the air longer than expected. Indeterminate did not mean non-existent. It meant untraceable, hidden, distributed. Elsewhere within the human debris field, a second relay activated. This one emitted a more complex signal, not a simple pulse, a structured sequence, encoded, layered, designed to propagate. Within seconds, the Coalition's long-range monitoring arrays began detecting synchronized activations across multiple distant sectors. Nodes that had previously shown no activity now began transitioning into operational states in a cascading sequence. Not simultaneous, sequential, coordinated. The realization began to take shape slowly, first in fragments, then in coherence. These systems were not activating randomly. They were responding, not to a command broadcast, but to a condition embedded within their own operational framework. Back on the flagship, a senior analyst opened a secured historical file referencing pre-contact human military doctrine. The document had been flagged years earlier, but never fully reviewed in detail. It described layered contingency strategies designed for scenarios where central command structures were compromised or destroyed. He scrolled rapidly. Lines of text described distributed command architecture, autonomous response triggers, and decentralized retaliation protocols designed to function even in the absence of direct oversight. At the bottom of the document, one section was marked with a classification tag that had previously been ignored. Trigger condition, flagship level asset neutralization. The analyst froze. He cross-referenced the designation, flagship level asset, the Aegis Vortex. The connection formed instantly. He looked up. Commander, the human warship we destroyed. Yes? The commander replied, still focused on incoming reports. It wasn't just a flagship. The room quieted slightly. It was a trigger node. Silence followed. Not disbelief. Not denial. Recognition. The analyst continued, his voice steady but urgent. According to their documented doctrine, certain assets are designed to function as distributed command initiators. If such an asset is destroyed under combat conditions, it doesn't signal defeat. He hesitated briefly. It signals activation of contingency frameworks. The commander's expression shifted. Explain. The analyst pointed toward the tactical display, where faint activations continue to spread across human control sectors. These systems we're seeing, they're not random. They're part of a pre-established network. The destruction of the Aegis Vortex likely served as a confirmation event. A confirmation event. The words carried weight. Not a failure. A validation. Another officer stepped forward. You're suggesting the ship was intentionally exposed? The analyst nodded slowly. Not exposed. Positioned. Its engagement parameters. They were never defensive in the traditional sense. They were designed to endure long enough to verify intent, capability, and hostility. The commander turned fully toward the display now. If that's true... He didn't finish the sentence immediately, because the implication was clear. The Coalition had not simply destroyed a warship. They had completed a requirement. Across multiple systems, additional data streams began to align with the same pattern. Energy signatures, relay activations, dormant installations. Everything now appeared less like scattered anomalies, and more like components of a larger structure coming online, not reacting to chaos. Executing a plan, one that had been designed long before the Coalition entered this region of space. The Aegis Vortex was not merely a vessel of war. It was a node within a network, a distributed intelligence framework capable of initiating responses across vast distances without centralized command input. Its destruction had not crippled humanity's defenses. It had completed a critical step in enabling them. On the flagship bridge, the atmosphere shifted again. The earlier confidence had not disappeared entirely, but it was now tempered by a growing understanding that the engagement had not been as one-sided as initially believed. Maintain defensive posture, the commander said quietly. All fleets are to remain on alert. No further expansion into human territory until we fully assess their capabilities. No one questioned the order, because now, the battlefield was no longer defined by a single destroyed ship. It had expanded, and somewhere within the layers of systems now awakening across human space. The response had already begun to take shape, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of a doctrine that had been waiting for this exact moment. It began without announcement. No warning sirens. No formal declaration of war. No final transmission from humanity. Across multiple star systems, hidden mechanisms that had lain dormant for years, or in some cases, decades, shifted from passive standby into active engagement with quiet precision. The Coalition's fleets would first notice a change, but not in the way they expected. It was not a single attack. It was synchronization. Long-range sensors began detecting coordinated energy signatures emerging from locations that had previously shown no strategic importance. Asteroid clusters, abandoned orbital platforms, derelict installations, places written off as irrelevant, suddenly emitted structured power readings. Not random, Not isolated, coordinated. On the flagship bridge, alarms did not immediately trigger. Instead, analysts observed the developments with growing focus as multiple data streams began converging into a pattern that was no longer ambiguous. Multiple activations confirmed across 3 sectors, a systems officer reported. Energy buildup consistent with weapons charging sequences. Identify source classification, the commander ordered. Unable to categorize all signatures, came the reply. Some match known human energy profiles, others do not correspond to any registered technology within coalition databases. That statement lingered, because it implied something unsettling. Humanity was not only activating known assets, they were revealing capabilities the coalition had never encountered. On the tactical display, vectors began to appear, thin lines extending from the newly activated nodes, converging on coalition fleet positions. These were not exploratory scans. They were targeting solutions, and they were already locked. All fleets, defensive posture, the commander said, his voice now fully composed but sharpened by awareness. Prepare countermeasures. Across coalition vessels, shields re-energized, weapon systems powered back up, point defense arrays activated in anticipation of incoming fire. They expected retaliation to mirror their own tactics. Visible fleets, direct engagement, predictable vectors. What arrived instead defied that expectation. The first strike did not come from a ship. It came from orbit. A previously unremarkable asteroid, long cataloged and ignored, suddenly underwent rapid internal energy release. Its core destabilized, not explosively in a traditional sense, but through a controlled structural collapse that redirected gravitational and kinetic forces along a calculated trajectory. The result was not fragmentation. It was propulsion. The asteroid accelerated with impossible precision toward a coalition vessel position at the edge of the formation. By the time sensors registered the movement as hostile, it was already too late to intercept. Point defense systems attempted to engage, firing concentrated bursts at the incoming object. Impact struck the asteroid surface, but its trajectory remained largely unaffected. Its structure reinforced or adapted in ways previously undetected, absorbed the disruption, and continued forward. Impact occurred seconds later. The collision was not merely destructive, it was catastrophic. The asteroid's mass, combined with velocity and the unexpected reinforcement of its internal structure, delivered a force that overwhelmed the targeted vessel's shields in a single, concentrated event. The ship was not destroyed piece by piece. It was overwhelmed. Across the formation, other coalition vessels reacted instantly, attempting to reorient their defenses, but more signals were already emerging, from multiple directions, simultaneous, coordinated. Hidden installations that had remained dormant now revealed their purpose. Orbital platforms, some ancient, some recently constructed but concealed, began emitting tightly focused energy beams. These were not broad area weapons. They were precision systems, each aligned to engage specific targets. Multiple coalition ships were struck in rapid succession, not randomly. Strategically, critical systems were targeted first: propulsion nodes, communication arrays, shield generators. Once disabled, secondary strikes followed, ensuring complete neutralization. In parallel, long-range kinetic platforms launched projectiles that traveled silently through space, their trajectories calculated to intercept fleet positions without deviation. There was no wasted motion, no excess fire. Every action served a purpose within a broader framework. On the flagship bridge, the scale of the engagement became undeniable. This is not a defensive response. One officer said quietly. The commander did not respond immediately, because the data confirmed it. What they were witnessing was not a scattered retaliation. It was a coordinated offensive, executed across multiple layers of infrastructure, spanning vast distances, and operated with a level of synchronization that suggested centralized intent, without centralized visibility. Humanity was fighting as if it had anticipated this exact scenario. Every system that activated did so with purpose. Every strike aligned with a broader operational pattern. And as coalition fleets attempted to regroup, another realization emerged. They were being systematically reduced, not through overwhelming numbers, but through precision. Their formations, once cohesive, began to fragment under sustained, targeted pressure. Communication channels experienced intermittent disruptions as key relay points were neutralized. Coordination between battle groups became increasingly difficult as command nodes were forced to adapt under continuous pressure. And still, no human flagship appeared. No centralized command signature emerged. No singular leader broadcasted orders across the battlefield. Instead, the war unfolded as a distributed execution of intent, as though humanity itself had become the command structure. On the tactical display, losses began to accumulate. Fleet integrity percentages declined. Reinforcement options diminished. Escape vectors narrowed. The Coalition had entered this engagement believing they were confronting a single ship. Now, they faced something far more complex. A civilization that did not rely on a single point of failure. A network that could endure the loss of its most visible asset and respond with coordinated force across the stars. The commander finally spoke, his voice measured, but no longer carrying the confidence it once held. "Reassess all assumptions," he said. "We are not engaged in a localized conflict." He paused, watching as another coalition vessel went dark on the display, then continued. "We are engaged with distributed war doctrine." And for the first time since the battle began, the coalition realized they were not the ones in control of its progression. The battlefield had changed, not in a single decisive moment, but through a series of irreversible shifts that left the coalition with a truth they could no longer ignore. Their fleets were still present, but fractured. Their formation still existed, but no longer cohesive. Their command structure still functioned, but with increasing friction as communication delays, disrupted relay chains, and localized system failures accumulated into something far more dangerous than any single defeat. They were no longer advancing. They were adapting under pressure, and every adaptation revealed the same underlying reality. They were responding to a war they had not fully understood from the beginning. Across multiple sectors, coalition vessels attempted to regroup, consolidating remaining assets into defensible clusters. Defensive grids were reinforced. Emergency protocols activated. Surviving commanders began issuing orders to stabilize their positions and prevent further losses. But even as they reorganized, the human systems continued their measured advance. Not reckless, not overwhelming, controlled, precision-driven. Each strike that followed seemed to carry intent beyond destruction. It was not simply about eliminating targets. It was about isolating them, limiting their options, and systematically dismantling their ability to function as a unified force. In several regions, coalition ships found themselves cut off entirely from central command. Their communication arrays were intact, yet unable to establish stable links beyond localized networks. Subspace channels flickered with interference patterns that did not behave like natural disruption. They were being segmented, contained. On the flagship bridge, the commander stood still as new data populated the main display. "What is our total operational status?" he asked. A pause followed as systems compiled the report. "Fleet strength reduced by approximately 47%, a systems officer replied. "Command relay efficiency reduced across all sectors. Multiple battle groups operating independently due to communication degradation. And human activity?" Another pause. "Continued activation across distributed systems," came the answer. No central command signature detected. However, coordination remains consistent. The commander nodded slowly. That was the most troubling part. Consistency without visibility. Coordination without a central node. The human response was not chaotic, it was structured, but its structure did not rely on anything the coalition could isolate or neutralize, because there was no single point to eliminate. A quiet tension spread across the bridge. Not fear in its most immediate sense, but recognition. They had expected to defeat a fleet. They had instead triggered a system. Elsewhere, surviving coalition units began receiving a final set of transmissions, not from individual human installations, not from a specific ship or command center, but from multiple points across human control space, all relaying a unified message, encrypted, synchronized, and now publicly broadcast across coalition channels. The message began with no identification, no introduction, just a statement. "You engage a vessel designed to confirm intent." The transmission paused briefly, then continued. "The asset you destroyed was not a singular point of command. It was a distributed node within a wider operational framework." On the bridge, analysts listened in silence as the message played across all active channels. "Its loss did not degrade our capability." Another pause. "It completed the conditions required for escalation." The commander's expression remained steady, but his eyes remained fixed on the display. The message was not emotional, not accusatory, not even triumphant. It was procedural. Matter of fact, humanity does not rely on centralized vulnerability. Our systems are designed to persist beyond the destruction of individual assets. The transmission continued, now accompanied by a visual overlay showing segments of human-controlled space. Nodes lighting up, Networks connecting, systems aligning into layers that had not been visible during the initial stages of the conflict. You attempted to eliminate a symbol. The words lingered. In doing so, you activated the framework it represented. Across coalition fleets, surviving commanders listened as the implications became undeniable. What you are now engaged with is not a singular force. A final pause. It is the consequence of your decision. The display on the flagship shifted slightly as additional data streams stabilized. Human systems were no longer merely activating. They were concluding their operational cycles in coordinated sequences, not rushing, not expanding indefinitely, but resolving, bringing the engagement toward an endpoint. The message reached its final segment. Civilizations that initiate conflict without understanding the structure of their opponent often misinterpret silence as weakness. The transmission ended. No threats followed. No demands. No further instructions. Just silence. On the flagship bridge, the commander finally spoke. Recall all remaining fleets to defensive consolidation. Cease further expansion into human-controlled sectors. No one questioned the order, because by now the conclusion was unavoidable. The war had already shifted beyond their original objectives, and in the aftermath of destroying what they believed was a lone warship, they had encountered something else entirely. Not a reaction, not a retaliation in the traditional sense, but a fully realized doctrine, activated, distributed, and now concluding its purpose. As the coalition adjusted to this new reality, one final truth became clear across every surviving command structure. They had not defeated humanity's warship. They had proven why it existed. And in doing so, they had learned, too late, that humanity's greatest strength was never meant to be seen in isolation. It was meant to be revealed only when everything else had already been set in motion.